Gus has a very, very illustrious career behind him, and it would take too long to go into any details about this. And I don't know if you've seen the flyer. We tried to publish at least a synopsis of his vita. It's in very small font, as you noticed. He was, among other things, he was administrator of the United Nations Development Program. He was the founder of the World Resources Institute. He was the chairman of the U.S. Council of Environmental Quality. He was a co-founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. So he's also a very distinguished author and has written several very, very influential books recently. The most recent one being The Bridge at the Edge of the World, Capitalism, the Environment, and Crossing from Crisis to Sustainability. And he tells me this was recently awarded the Washington Post Book of the Year Award. And today he's going to talk about some ideas that came out of that experience of writing that book and thinking about it. He's going to expand, I think, on some of the things that came out of there. I should mention that this lecture series is part of the Solutions lecture series, we're calling it, co-sponsored by the journal Solutions, the Gund Institute, the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, and the Institute for Global Sustainability. So join me all in welcoming Gus Speth.
Thank you, Bob. For a lot of us in the world, larger world, Bob Costanza is a hero who has helped to invent the whole field of ecological economics and done such path-breaking work. So when he asked me to come, I couldn't say no, and I just want all of you to know how high the world holds him in regard, and you're lucky to have him here with you at the university. As Bob noted, I started in this field 40 years ago. It's been a long time now. But when I arrived at Yale a while back, I thought it was time to step back and do an assessment, a personal assessment of whether I had been successful in my life, whether the environmental cause that I signed up with at the first Earth Day in 1970 had been successful, and whether we were making the kind of progress and fulfilling the dreams that we had back then. And the harder I looked at the information that's available on environmental conditions and trends and related issues, the more disturbed I became personally. And so I wrote 2 books about it, both of which are still available in large quantities, I think. But one was called Red Sky at Morning, and another was This Bridge at the Edge of the World. The first one dealt with the global scale problems, and the second one with our problems here in the United States. And basically, I've come to 2 big conclusions. One is, let me express it in terms of a paradox. The paradox is that we, in the environmental community, got stronger, more sophisticated, better funded, more members, and the environment continued to go downhill. And how do we explain that? Secondly, the other conclusion that I want to talk about today is that we're all in such silos in terms of our interest. Perhaps not you as students, but if you go out and work for a development organization, a group that's worried about international development, you'll find that your friends, the other groups you work with are all in that area, and the population groups are there, and the environmental groups are here, and the social justice groups are there, and groups that are trying to revitalize our democracy and have clean elections without money corrupting them are over there. And everybody's in these silos. And one of the big conclusions that I've come to very late in life is that really it's all just one big sort of progressive issue. And I want to try to explain that. to you. These issues are powerfully linked up, and perhaps you know that because you haven't had this perversion of life experience where you get channeled into such a narrow field. So I'm going to tell you today my reflections after 40 years of being in the trenches, so to speak, of American environmentalism, global environmentalism, and working at international development at the UN for a long time. And I'm going to tell you that this is the unvarnished truth that, as I see it. I don't want to pull any punches. I'm too old. It's not pretty, what I've come to. And indeed, the conclusions are very disturbing to me personally. But I'm convinced that we'll never do the things that we need to do to deal with these problems unless we confront this reality, unless we say things that are fundamentally challenging to the dominant system in which we live and work. So here are the conclusions that I've come to, if you will. If you ask today what the dominant goals of economic life should be, what our economy, thank you, should be striving for, I think most of us would reply that we should be trying to enhance, the economy should be enhancing social well-being while sustaining democratic prospects and sustaining environmental quality. And if we judge our system by this standard, America's political economy is failing today. It's failing big time. Social conditions, which I will go through some of them with you, are deplorable. Our democracy is terribly weak, actually, and the environment is in a crisis. So I think there are many ways that we could approach the question of assessing the social well-being. Right now, the reigning policy orientation is that the path to greater well-being is to grow the economy, to grow productivity, wages, profits, the stock market, consumption, all of them have to go up. And the truth is that this growth imperative can undermine our families, our jobs, our communities, certainly the environment, because it's confidently asserted and widely believed in our society that this growth is worth the price. It's the price that all those costs are the prices that we have to pay for the benefits of growth. And we measure this growth by tallying up the gross domestic product, the GDP, and the profits at the company level, and we get what we measure, don't we? But there's really an expanding body of evidence now that's telling us to think again about this situation. In our very affluent society, aggregate economic growth, GDP growth, is no longer yielding large benefits to society. And in many, many ways, it's making us worse off, environmentally, socially, psychologically. The psychologists, for example, are increasingly pointing out that while economic output per capita has gone up and up over recent decades, there's been no comparable or even any increase in life satisfaction or overall happiness in our society, and yet levels of distrust and depression have grown substantially. Many social scientists now depict American society as having gone astray, having locked into patterns that were once useful but no longer are. We're substituting more and more GDP growth and more consumption for dealing with our real issues. For example, psychologist David Myers sees this pattern of rising wealth and shrinking spirit as the American paradox, he calls it. He observes that Americans have found themselves with big houses and broken homes, with high incomes and low morale, with secured rights and diminished civility. We are excelling, he writes, in making a living, but too often failing at making a life. We celebrated our prosperity, but yearn for purpose. We cherished our freedoms, but longed for connection. In an age of plenty, we are feeling a spiritual hunger. Another dimension of the failure of today's political economy, beyond this psychological one, is the crisis of objective inequality, which is now, I would submit, unraveling our social fabric. It's a crisis of soaring executive pay, huge incomes, and highly concentrated wealth, increasingly concentrated in a very small minority of people, occurring simultaneously with poverty near a 30-year high, stagnant wages despite the fact that productivity has been going up, with declining social mobility in our society, record levels of people without health insurance even before the recession, our failing schools, swelling jails, more people in jail than any other industrial country per capita, the increased job insecurity, and the longest work hours in the whole OECD. Almost all of these trends exacerbated by the current recession. So this gaping social and economic inequality in our society actually also poses a grave risk to the third element, our democracy. My friend Bob Dahl, who I guess could be thought of as America's senior political scientist at this point, wrote recently in his book, Political Inequality, that it's highly plausible that powerful international and domestic forces could push towards an irreversible level of political inequality that so greatly impairs our present democratic institutions as to render the ideals of democracy and political equality virtually irrelevant. What we're really seeing is a vicious circle. Income disparities, as they increase, shift political access and influence to the wealthy constituencies and businesses, and that in turn further imperils the potential of the democratic process to correct the growing disparities. Well, that's some comments on the social situation, the political situation, and now I want to turn to the environmental situation. And here's one measure of our environmental problem. All we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world for example, my grandchildren, is just keep doing exactly what we're doing today. With no growth in the human population, no growth in the world economy. Just keep releasing greenhouse gases at the current rates. Just continue to impoverish ecosystems at the current rates. Just continue to release toxic chemicals at the current rates. And in the latter part of this century, the planet that you will inherit will be effectively a ruined one, certainly by any normal standard. But of course, human activities aren't holding at the current level, are they? They're accelerating dramatically. In 1950, when I was 8, the size of the world economy was $7 trillion. And it took all of history to grow a $7 trillion world economy. How long does it take now to add another $7 trillion to the world economy? Less than a decade. Less than a decade. At typical rates of growth, not the ones of last year, but typical rates that we've experienced in recent decades, the world economy will double in about 20 years or less, and likely double again. So we could have 4 or 5 times at that rate the economic activity on the planet by mid-century. Just when, increasing enormously the pressures for environmental deterioration, just at the time when we should be trying to decrease those pressures from what they are. So these trends are the environmental problems are most starkly revealed in the global trends, I think. And this is an area where the U.S. policy and U.S. behavior is deeply complicit. We know now, thanks in part to the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment and other surveys, that about half the world's wetlands and a third of the mangroves are gone. 90% of the large predator fish in the oceans are gone. 75% of marine fisheries are fished to capacity or overfished. 20% of the coral is gone, and another 20% severely damaged and going fast. About half of the world's temperate and tropical forests are gone. The rate of deforestation in the tropics has been about an acre a second for decades now. Species are estimated to be disappearing at a rate 1,000 times the rate at which species normally go extinct. We haven't seen such a spasm of extinction since the dinosaurs disappeared. And of course, each one of us is the host to probably scores of toxic chemicals with unknown consequences. We also know that human impacts on the planet are large relative to natural systems. We depleted the Earth's stratospheric ozone layer without even knowing we were doing it. Most importantly, we've increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere substantially. Carbon dioxide, for example, up about a third over pre-industrial levels. And the result is that we've now started in earnest the very dangerous process of climate disruption and warming the planet and disrupting the planet's climate. Everywhere we look now, almost, ice fields are disappearing, glaciers are disappearing. We know also that industrial processes are overloading the planet with nitrogen and phosphorus. And we now, as a result, have identified hundreds of dead zones in our oceans due to overfertilization. We estimate that we're consuming or destroying or otherwise getting rid of about 40% of nature's net photosynthetic output every year, and leaving far too little for the rest of the species here with us. We now are withdrawing about half of the accessible runoff in the rivers and streams and lakes of our planet, and that rate is growing very dramatically, soon to be 70% probably. The following rivers no longer reach the ocean in the dry season: the Colorado, the Yellow, the Ganges, the Nile, among others. So in this sense, today's political economy, the system that we live and work in, is failing us. It's failing us socially, it's failing us environmentally, it's failing us politically. I don't know any other way to read the information that we have before us. We've been trying for decades to deal with all of these issues. So how best do we describe this system of political economy? Well, with increasingly few exceptions, the system of political economy that we have today, the operating system of the world today, is modern capitalism, corporate, consumerist capitalism. Not the capitalism of the textbook, certainly not the capitalism of Adam Smith, but the capitalism of the street, if you will, what we really have as a political economy. Well, inherent in the dynamics of this capitalism is a very powerful drive to grow, to earn profits, to invest them, to innovate in the economy. And the result is that we've had enormous economic expansion. The capitalist era has been, I don't know if you've seen the Samuelson Nordhaus basic economics textbook, but in the back of it they show just the economic growth in the U.S. And even on a log scale, it's increasing exponentially. So this capitalist system is fantastic at generating growth and accumulating wealth. But here's how I would describe it from an environmental point of view. The key features of this capitalism, as it is constituted today, work together to produce an economic and a political reality that's highly destructive of environment. An unquestioning society-wide commitment to economic growth at almost any cost. Powerful corporate interests whose overriding objective is to grow by generating profit, including the profit from avoiding the environmental costs that they create, and the profit from replicating technologies that were originally designed without any concern for the environment. Markets that systematically fail to recognize environmental costs unless government corrects the market, and government that is in turn subservient to corporate interest and the growth imperative. A rampant consumerism spurred by an addiction to novelty and sophisticated advertising, and now an economic activity level that's so large in scale that its impacts alter the fundamental biophysical operation of the planet. This is what we have today, and it combines, all these features combine to deliver an ever-growing world economy that's undermining the ability of the planet to support life. Now, this environmental reality is linked powerfully to the growing social inequality that I mentioned and to the erosion of democratic governance and true popular control. How does that happen? Well, we live and work in a system of political economy that cares profoundly about profits and growth, and it cares about society and the natural world in which it operates, mainly to the extent that it's required to do so. And it's up to us as citizens to inject into this system values of fairness, of human solidarity, of environmental sustainability. And the principal vehicle that we have for injecting these values into this system is government. And the problem is that we typically fail at this assignment of putting real human values into the system because our politics are too enfeebled and government is excessively under the thumb of powerful corporate interest and concentrations of great wealth. And we see that today with healthcare battle in Washington. We see it today in the looming fight to save the climate and get our energy policy straight. Just beginning. Just consider for a moment the link between the recent financial collapse and our ongoing environmental crisis. Both of them are the result of a system in which those with economic power are propelled and not restrained by government to take dangerous risks for the sake of great profit. That's the common denominator in both of these situations. And we see when we think about it this way that the goals of environmental sustainability, of social equity, of strong democracy are all linked up powerfully. Now, the case for working together to get congressional action today on climate, on health care, and other big issues is a compelling case, I think. But I also believe, and this is fundamental to my thinking anyhow, but these big social and environmental challenges that I've just reviewed are not going to yield in the end to problem-solving type incrementalism. That's what we've been doing. The group that I helped to start, the Natural Resources Defense Council, now has a budget of $100 million a year, offices all over the country, and we're still barely, if we're lucky, we'll get a weak climate bill out of the Congress after all of this effort and all of Al Gore and everything else that we've seen in the past year. So we've gone down this path of incremental reform for decades. And the results of that experiment are in now. We're failing. at it. It's not a strategy for real success. It's a strategy for smoothing out the rough edges and buying a little time. So we've got to see that the roots of our environmental and social problems are in fact deeply systemic. They require a type of transformative change, not the incremental change that we have been having. And I want to argue that what is required is a shift to a new sustaining economy, ushered on by a new politics. For the most part, those of us like myself have worked within this current system of political economy. But working within that system is not going to succeed when what we truly need is transformative change in the system itself. Not an embrace of some crazy socialism, but a decisive move beyond the type and variety of capitalism that we have today. So what circumstances might make such transformative change and the birth of a sustaining economy possible? Well, a spreading loss of legitimacy, which a lot of people now share, that the system is failing to deliver social and environmental well-being and lacks fundamental legitimacy. A mounting sense of imminent crisis, which anybody who understands the climate issue must have. All of this occurring at a time of wise leadership. Maybe we have wise leadership. Accompanied by a new American narrative, a new American dream, a new American story, and the appearance across the landscape of successful models, of new types of business models, of new types of community models. More localization than globalization. Well, all of these things would help in this transformative process. But I would also argue that most of all we need a new politics and a new social movement in our country that's powerful enough to drive real change. Our best hope for a new political dynamic is the fusion of those concerned about environment with those concerned about social justice, with those concerned about political democracy into one progressive force for change. We're all communities of shared fate, and we'll rise or fall together in this process of trying to inject human, sustainable solidarity values into this system. We'll rise or fall together because we face the same reality, a political economy today that doesn't prioritize sustaining human and natural communities. So I want to talk first now in somewhat more detail about what this new economy might look like and what's the case for a new economy. And then I want to talk about the case for a new politics in more detail. Well, we're routinely told all the time that we should be seeking a strong economy. But I think we know now that we should actually be seeking first a strong society, a strong nature, a strong democracy. And that today's economy, as I have tried to explain, in fact offers little help in these regards. It pushes against these things, not us towards them. So in fact, we need to reinvent the economy to build this sustaining economy. Sustaining people, sustaining communities, and nature. These ought to be seen as the core goals of economic activity, the priorities of economic activity, not hope for byproducts of market success, of overall economic growth, and some modest regulation. And that's where we are today. Economic growth may be the world's secular religion today, but for most of the world's people, it's a god that's failing. Underperforming for the majority of people, particularly in the developing world, and for those of us in the affluent societies, growth creating more problems for us than it is solving. this never-ending drive to grow the economy at all costs. Even Samuelson and Nordhaus refer to it as the ruthless economy. It can undermine workers, jobs, the environment. It also fuels a powerful international search for energy and other resources. And it rests on a manufactured consumerism that really doesn't meet the deepest human needs. So I think before it's too late, America's got to move to a post-growth society where working life, where the natural environment, where our communities and the public sector are no longer sacrificed for the sake of mere GDP growth, where the illusory promises of ever more growth no longer provide an excuse for dealing generously with our compelling social needs. And it is the excuse that we provide all the time, that we invoke all the time for dealing directly with our problems. We're going to produce growth and that will solve the problems, and it doesn't. And where truly democratic politics is no longer held hostage to the primacy of powerful corporate interest. If I had to say today, do we really have a democracy in the United States of America, or do we have a corptocracy where the corporations are the most powerful political actors as well as the most powerful economic actors? I'd say we have a corptocracy. We have, they are running the country today more than popular sovereignty is running the country. This open-ended commitment to aggregate economic growth is consuming environmental and social capital, and both are now severely diminished. But I want to stress that at the same time, it's abundantly clear that our society and others do need to grow along many dimensions. We need a democratically determined pattern of growth. We need growth in good jobs. We need growth in the incomes of the poor, in the availability of health care, in education, in investment in public infrastructure, infrastructure like urban and interurban transport, in water, waste management, in environmental amenity. We need growth in the deployment of climate-friendly technologies as rapidly as we can bring them online. Growth in the restoration of ecosystems, and growth in the transformation of our local communities. Growth in non-military government spending at the expense of this vast military operation. And growth in international assistance to help literally the half of mankind that lives on less than $2 a day. So even in a post-growth society, there are a great many things that we do need to grow. And we need targeted policies that directly address these objectives and stimulate growth in these areas. And I would argue that a particular set of policies are important, policies that can actually improve welfare while dampening economic growth. Contrary to, they always go together. They don't. Consider policies like a shorter work week and longer vacations. People throughout the United States want more time with their families, more time with their friends, more time to develop themselves. Greater labor protections and job security and benefits. Restrictions on advertising, particularly advertising to children like they have in Sweden. A new design for the 21st century corporation, a design that embraces rechartering, new ownership patterns of enterprise, and treating the stakeholders as the primary interest and not always the shareholders. Incentives for local production and consumption. Strong social and environmental provisions in trade agreements. Really rigorous environmental and consumer protection. You may have seen the expose in the New York Times the other day about the failing Clean Water Act. Amazing information. Here we are. When I started litigating the Water Act in 1972, when it first was written, and I was in tears. Greater economic and social equality in our society. Heavy spending on public services. These are the kinds of things that will improve quality of life in our society and actually slow economic growth at the same time. We'll talk a minute about the economic crisis that we are in now. It's generated a lot of soul searching. It's made a lot of people think about what the economic system that we're in and think hard about the need for something better. Americans are struggling today with the combined impacts of financial losses, tighter credit, huge layoffs, unemployment, approaching 10%. These problems are associated today with a slowdown in GDP growth, but this failure of growth is not truly the cause of these problems. And these problems aren't necessarily going to be cured by ramping up GDP growth either. We've had a lot of jobless growth in the past. We're having it today, and we could have a lot more in the future. It's now appreciated that the current recession and the consequences that it's bringing on are the result of government failing to intervene appropriately in the marketplace. Financial markets were massively deregulated. We could also have been intervening in housing markets and in labor markets to head off some of the pain. So we're on the receiving end today of misguided policies as well as reckless behavior on Wall Street. And, you know, a clear lesson of today's failure is that markets don't function well without strong and effective government action. This economic crisis should also convince us, and perhaps lead us to live more simply and focus more locally. It's time to move beyond our hyperventilating lifestyles, our affluenza. There's been too little focus on consumption in the environmental community. And I hope this crisis will lead people to rediscover that the truly important things in life are not for sale at the mall or indeed anywhere. The psychological studies from this new field of positive psychology are telling us over and over again that materialism, this focus on getting and spending, is toxic, actually, to a sense of happiness and well-being. And that we really do get a sense of happiness and well-being, in fact, not from that, but from warm personal relationships and from giving rather than getting. So I think in our society there's a growing sense that we have experienced a huge misdirection of life's energy. 81% of American people say that we've been too focused on shopping and spending. 88% think our society is too materialistic. 84% want to spend more time with family and friends. Well, even if this is half right, and people exaggerating in these polls, they suggest that there's a powerful base to build change. I want to talk now about the new politics. If we think about it, this serious, deep change in today's capitalism depends fundamentally on far-reaching and effective government action. How else can the market be made to work for the environment and for society rather than against it? How can corporate behavior be altered or programs that meet real human needs be promoted? So government truly is the principal means that we have as citizens to exercise our responsibility to promote environmental stewardship, to make the world a better place. So this drive for transformative change leads immediately into the political arena, where what we need is a vital, muscular democracy steered by an informed and engaged citizenry. Well, you must be thinking, that doesn't sound much like the town hall meetings, and it doesn't. If we state the matter this way, it really suggests the enormity of the challenge, because the truth is that our democratic governance processes in our country today are in deep trouble. Our democracy has been characterized as weak, shallow, corrupted by money. There are many reasons why government in Washington today is at least as big a part of the problem than it is a part of the solution. It's hooked itself on GDP growth for its revenues, for its constituencies, for its influence abroad. It's been captured by the very corporations and concentrations of wealth it should be seeking to regulate, and is hobbled by an array of dysfunctional institutional arrangements which begin with the way we elect our presidents. So how do we get out of this situation? Well, let me give you some dimensions of what I see this new economy, new politics as being. First, I think we need a unified agenda among the progressive communities. Political action has got to embrace a profound commitment to social justice, a sustained challenge to consumerism and the lifestyles that it offers, a healthy skepticism of growth mania, and a redefinition of what society should be seeking to grow, a challenge to corporate dominance, and a redefinition of the corporation and its goal, and a commitment to deep change in the functioning and reach of the market. A related issue to which the new politics has got to return is to pay major attention to political reforms. The government, the politics that we have today will never deliver sustainability. We need to, here are some things that, I think are in fact environmental issues, deeply environmental issues. Campaign finance reform, regulation of lobbying, revitalization of large-scale membership organizations that give citizens more leverage in the political process, measures to increase voter turnout, open primaries, nonpartisan congressional districting, a minimum free TV time for all federal candidates meeting basic requirements, and so on. There's a long list of things that we need to do to revitalize our democracy, including getting the money out of it, and groups like Common Cause and Americans for Campaign Reform and the Durbin Bill, which is pending in the Senate right now, which would provide for federally financing congressional elections. These are huge environmental issues. And if you raise them in the Council of Environmental Groups today, you'll be told those aren't environmental issues, those are some Common Cause issues or some other group's issues. But we'll never deal with our environmental problems until we start getting our political system straightened out. So if the first watchword of a new politics is to broaden the agenda, the second one is to get political. The whole environmental community that I've grown up with has been, by and large, a wonkish, inside the Beltway community, lobbying and litigating. It has not been a political force in our country. It has not had high political salience. It has not been organizing constituencies of voters around the country and building up a political force. We've got to go there. It started, but we have made modest only steps. And the final watchword has got to be to build a movement. We need to bring together this entire collection of progressive people who want to save the environment, want to revitalize our democracy, want to achieve an equitable and fair society. This new politics has got to be broadly inclusive, reaching out to embrace union members and working families, minorities, people of color, religious organizations, environmentalists, women's movement, and all the communities of shared fate, because that's what we are. We've got to overcome this silo effect that I was mentioning earlier. In the end, we know that these things are not going to happen unless we are prepared to struggle for them, to drive real change. If there's a model within recent memory of what we need today, I would say it's the civil rights revolution of the 60s. It's not perfectly analogous, of course, but it had grievances, and we do. It knew what was causing them, and we are discovering what is causing our grievances. And it also knew that the current order had no legitimacy. And we are learning that too. And that acting together, they could redress those grievances. It was a confrontational movement. It was disobedient, but it was nonviolent. And it had a dream, and it had Martin Luther King Jr. King was murdered in '68. Bobby Kennedy was murdered in '68. In the book that Mark Kurlansky wrote about 1968, he writes the following: "The year 1968 was a terrible year, and yet one for which many people feel nostalgia. Despite the thousands dead in Vietnam, the millions starved in Biafra, the crushing of idealism in Poland and Czechoslovakia, the massacre in Mexico, the clubbing of dissenters all over the world, the murder of the two Americans who most offered hope to the world, to many, despite these things, to many, it was a year of great possibilities, and it is missed. As Camus wrote in The Rebel, those who long for peaceful times are longing not for the alleviation, but for the silencing of misery." The thrilling thing, he writes, about the year 1968 was that it was a time when significant segments of the populations all over the globe refused to be silent about the many things that were wrong with the world. They could not be silenced. There were too many of them, and if they were given the opportunity, they would stand in the street and shout about them. And this gave the world a sense of hope. A hope that it had rarely had. A sense that where there is a wrong, there will be people who will expose it and try to change it. Well, I think it's time to regain this sense of hope. We all carried forward by hope in our lives. And the hope in this case is that a better world is indeed possible, and that by working together we can build it. Thank you very much.